Thank you for this generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here, and it's my pleasure to share my ongoing work with you on death and thinking about the death in the context of your workshop on creating and recreating the self. So thank you for this opportunity. So they told me not to block the screen. I'm just trying to make sure maybe I should move in this direction, right? All right. Am I loud enough, or do I need a microphone? I'm just making sure. You can hear me? Yeah. Great. All right. Death is a universal human experience. There is, of course, nothing more integral to the human experience than death. Death is what gives meaning to life, what shapes memory and history. And as historians, our job is partly to speak to the dead or make the dead speak to us. We do this by various means, but mostly by spending a good many hours reading texts written by dead people to understand their values, thoughts, worldviews, judgments, and feelings. Today I'm going to share my research on death in early modern Ottoman society in relation to the body and creation of the self. First, I will show the pervasiveness of death in the life of early modern Ottoman society by surveying major death events, major mortality events, in particular in Istanbul, because this was where death was most visible. Then I will contrast this, the pervasiveness of death, as we know from the historical experience, with the current neglect of death as a topic of study in the current historiography, and invite us to rethink why this is the case. And finally, I will share some preliminary thoughts on how we can explore death in early modern Ottoman history. Early modern Istanbul, the glorious capital of the Ottoman Empire, and a vibrant commercial and cultural cosmopolitan port city, was notorious for its perils. Myriad contemporary observers stressed the city's experience with devastating epidemics, fires, and other catastrophes, owed not least to its crowdedness, but also to numerous problems resulting from its particular location, climate, and prosperity. Unlike other major port cities of the early modern Mediterranean, Istanbul was susceptible to predicaments that came from the sea, such as an influx of infections, immigrants, and unruly sailors, along with a range of invasive species, animal and plant species, and precarious, if not outright lethal, substances, ideas, and commodities and trends. Its overland connections to the Balkans and Anatolia likewise exposed it to troubles brought along major caravan routes, spanning networks near and far. A hub where multiple economic, military, administrative, and biological networks within the Ottoman domains and beyond converged, Istanbul was thus a critical destination for everything in motion, material or otherwise. In the same way it received goods, capital, people, knowledge, and talent, it attracted disease and death. Throughout the early modern period, the city's tribulations intensified, proportionate to its growing number of bodies it hosted. As its population increased, problems of housing, sustenance, poverty, unrest, and crime escalated, along with fires, plagues, and mass mortality crises instigated by such whims of nature as earthquakes, floods, and weather events. In other words, Istanbul's rising affluence and prosperity came at the cost of untimely death for many of its residents and visitors alike. Even though I focus on the experience of death and mass mortality events in the case of early modern Istanbul, it is somewhat possible to extend this to other major urban centers of the empire. But my work so far covers only Istanbul, and I apologize for that, and I'm looking forward to feedback from the audience. Hence, Istanbul was as much the capital of death as it was of the empire's blossoming lives. Arguably, more people died in Istanbul and its surroundings than anywhere else in the empire's vast landholdings in the early modern era. This was, of course, inevitable, for Istanbul was the most populous city in the early modern Mediterranean world, and at the end of the 18th century, perhaps the largest city in the world. In the mid-16th century, the city's resident population was upwards of 500,000 people. Moreover, it was visited by an endless stream of visitors, merchants, scholars, mystics, and adventurers. Just to offer a sense of comparison of Istanbul's population to other contemporary cities of the early modern era, for example, Cairo was upwards of 400,000 people, but most other Mediterranean cities had significantly smaller populations in the 16th century. For example, Naples had around 200,000 people in the late 16th century. Venice had 168,000 people in 1563, and Milan about 180,000 at the close of the century. Just to give you a sense of comparison, Istanbul is much larger in terms of its population than any other city of the early Mediterranean. So home to a vast population, Istanbul's experience with death merits historical inquiry in its own right. So Istanbul as the capital of death. Like all pre-modern cities, death was ubiquitous in Istanbul. Urbanites died as a result of natural and unnatural causes, including from accidents, ill health, and violent crimes. Yet in far greater numbers from mass mortality events caused by wars, epidemics, fires, famines, riots and rebellions, and natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, and climate events. As such, death was much more present in the lives of individuals in the pre-modern era, who experienced the death of others more frequently than the moderns. Life expectancy was much lower across the pre-modern world. In 1800, the global average of life expectancy at birth was not higher than 30 years. And throughout the early modern era, it fluctuated between 30 and 40 years. Even though we don't have reliable statistical figures for the Ottoman case or Istanbul, I believe it should be safe to assume that an individual in early modern Istanbul did not expect to have an average life expectancy no more than 40 years. And this is life expectancy of birth. Of course, it includes infant and child mortality. So if an individual would pass the age of childhood, then perhaps a longer life expectancy could be expected, perhaps 45 to 50 years. So given the prevalence of endemic childhood diseases such as measles, jaundice, smallpox, and the high rates of infant and child mortality, individuals went through the different stages of life, such as childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and old age, much faster than their modern counterparts. Reaching puberty signaled that boys and girls were considered as adults and allowed them to have legal rights in marriage. Even though the age of puberty showed variation across time and space, 16th century Ottoman tax registers suggest that 15 was the age of puberty for boys and 12 for girls. An individual that made to adulthood likely experienced multiple bouts of suffering and hence was armed with an array of biological and psychological immunity. To make matters even worse, we should note that the early modern era was a time of environmental and biological crisis. On a global scale, the Great Transition from the second half of the 13th century to the mid-15th had already set the stage for a new ecological regime, and the Little Ice Age precipitated the circulation of biological killers such as plague, smallpox, and syphilis at an unprecedented scale. Istanbuliots likely wished to meet the angel of death in their sleep, peacefully. A good death, that is to say, a natural, non-violent death, was much to be desired by everyone, as suggested by the existence of a large number of prayers and talismans put to use to that end. Medical literature of the time underscores the anxieties about sudden death and violent death, and helps identify the causes of death that were feared most. For example, in his treatise on plague and other epidemic diseases, the renowned polymath of the 15th century, Abdurrahman al-Bistami, recommends prayers and other protective methods to ward off the plague, the most dreaded of all diseases. Interestingly, he also lists other causes of death that such methods were believed to offer protection from. Among these were sudden death, accidents, burning, and drowning in water. Bistami's list suggests that these forms of death, along with lesser ills he mentions such as migraine, anxiety, insanity, bedwetting, and nightmares, reflect the anxieties of this time about most feared causes of death. Similarly, Hacı Pasha, the prominent 15th century Anatolian physician, also lists plague remedies following other dangerous conditions such as rabies, food poisoning, and scorpion and snake bites. In his compendium, Muntakhab Shifa, even though he discusses each ailment in a separate entry and presents appropriate methods of treatment, these conditions were slightly outside of the mainstream medical knowledge and much feared on account of being fatal. Whether caused by natural or catastrophic reasons, death was a well-integrated component of life in early modern urban Ottoman society. Despite continuous efforts of the Ottoman administration to separate the physical space of the dead and the living by moving communal graveyards outside the city walls, regulating burials, and imposing control over interment procedures, death was still very much part and parcel of urban life. It was fully present in the sensory landscape of the city. The experience of death was freely accessible to the living, not only to the close family members who prepared the deceased for interment by washing the body and shrouding the deceased, but also to other members of the community. Even though different funerary customs followed by the city's different confessional communities, and here we have some images about different burial practices of funerary practice of different religious groups, death was largely visible. In the case of course, funeral prayers and processions, interment as public events. It was tangible. Individuals carried the coffin of the deceased on their shoulders and threw soil on the grave. And death was smellable because we have evidence, mention of burning of incense during funeral processions and using of flowers. And it was audible. Announcements were announcements of death from mosques, prayers during funerals were made, and there were also in some cases weepers. So we know that it was very much integrated to the sensory realm of the citizens. So from helping carry the coffin to digging and covering the grave, the process was a time when members of the family and community could take part in to say their last farewell to the deceased and pray for the salvation of their soul. Arguably, death was a constant in the sensorial realm of the city's residents, with graveyards scattered across the city. this was especially true for the imperial elite, who often left behind pious endowments, waqfs, to be remembered after their deaths. So a few scenes from funerary scenes from the Ottoman sultans. Okay, maybe we can leave it this one. Istanbuliots were connected to the city's deceased residents in many ways. They lived alongside the city's dead, the honorary citizens of Istanbul. Cemeteries, both within the city walls and outside of it, emerged as spaces of contemplation and remembrance of the dead, but simultaneously of celebration of life. Tombs of religious dignitaries and Sufi leaders became local shrines that Istanbuliots visited to seek their blessings and intercession. The dead were often conjured up in the cultural imagination of the learned Ottomans. Teachers, Sufi sheikhs, poets, and biographers embraced the dead as part of their own cultural world, connecting with past lives, using them as models or guides for their problems. One manifestation of this attitude is the proliferation of literary genres in the early modern period, such as biographies of Ottoman poets, Sufis, and other learned men, whose explicit goal was to revive the memory of learned men of the past and celebrate their accomplishments. So let's take a look at the major mortality events in the history of Istanbul. It is not my intention to offer an exhaustive list of all the great fires and epidemics and plagues in the city's history, but it may be helpful to mention just a few to give you a sense of the scale and the impact of such occurrences in the city's history. It is perhaps possible to categorize them into three different categories. Such would be forces of nature, which includes, of course, earthquakes and floods, biological killers, plagues and epidemics, or as a third category, urban perils, fires, riots, and crimes. So just taking a look at these mass mortality events very briefly, perhaps it's important to mention that earthquakes have been an important event in the history of the city, of course, even before the Ottoman conquest of the city. And many major earthquakes hit Istanbul during the Ottoman period, perhaps the most significant one being the earthquake of 1509, which is remembered in Ottoman sources as the Little Doomsday, and it is recorded as many as 5,000 people may have lost their life during this outbreak. And here we have a representation of the city soon after this earthquake, and we see at least some minaret of mosques showing as destroyed. We have other depictions from Istanbul's experience from major earthquakes. Here we see the representation of the earthquake of 1556. And of course, earthquakes also caused major loss in property, destruction of houses, as well as mosques and other buildings, and at times city walls. Other natural events are also marked in the city's history by the contemporary chroniclers of the time. Sometimes we hear the mention of major climate events, comets, floods, and these are topics that we can read in the contemporary chronicles. And so we have evidence about a number of important natural disasters that Istanbul went through during the early modern period. And for biological killers, of course, we can mention a number of epidemic and endemic diseases, but I would like to emphasize the importance of plague among such biological killers in the history of early modern Istanbul. Again, it is not my intention to overview all the major epidemics that affected Istanbul in the early modern era, but I think it should suffice to say that Istanbul's experience with the plague, at least in terms of mortality, we need to think of the plague, the role of plague as being the most dominant killer in comparison to all other forms of natural and unnatural sources of mortality. We have a number of outbreaks recorded in the case of Ottoman Istanbul, and the experience with plague epidemics and mortality is something that is very much part of the historical picture as we see its representation in the historical documents pertaining to the history of plague in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the earliest registers about death count come from early 16th century Ottoman records, and it may even be important to point out that these records preceded the systematic death registers kept in Venice and other Italian cities. And in fact, the bills of mortality in London would start much later, towards the end of the 17th century. So a number of epidemic outbreaks, plague outbreaks affected Istanbul throughout the early modern period. I'm just giving you some examples of documents that recorded mortality during epidemic outbreaks, but I'd be happy to tell more about plague if during Q&A. So I'll just skip over that for the time being. So fires, riots, and other types of crime that affected Istanbul. Of course, very important fires in the city history need to be mentioned, mostly on account of houses being, wood houses being the major form of structure. So we have evidence of a number of fires that devastated the city houses and, of course, killed a number of people each time. And also very narrow streets, tightly packed houses, and the changing wind patterns of the city were all important factors in leading to such events. And perhaps it may be helpful to mention at least one major fire in Istanbul in 1660, among many others, but this one was recorded to be extremely destructive and recorded to have burned or damaged several tens of thousands of houses and up to 4,000 casualties as a result of this fire. And of course, continuous fires in the city caused a lot of urban changes in urban planning. Perhaps in addition to these major forms of or sources of mortality, we can also talk about crime in this context briefly. And of course, crime and urban unrest made Istanbul a locus of violent death. People died in riots, street violence, and myriad forms of punishments executed in public, and miscellaneous acts of crime, including murder, rape, kidnap, and robbing, that haunted the public imagination for causing violent deaths. And here we have a very unpleasant picture of impalement, but I just wanted to show this, produced by a contemporary Flemish artist, so I'll skip over this one.
This is crime? Was this?
Well, I mean, source of punishment, and just, I would argue that it added to Istanbul's the violence or the damage inflicted on the bodies, and perhaps, of course, it's not really, in that sense, a crime, but it's part of the larger scene of mortality, I would argue. So together, crime and urban unrest made Istanbul a very dangerous city. And in fact, some groups of people were notoriously associated with violent behavior and crime. Sailors, usually, Ottoman and foreign, and immigrants, typically, and Janissaries were usually associated with violent behavior and crime. In fact, we can add to it at the end of the 16th century, early 17th century, Celali revolts in Anatolia also sparked a new wave of migration to Istanbul and peasants fleeing violence, sought refuge in the capital in search of safety. And so crime was commonly associated with these groups of individuals in the city. Janissaries, most notoriously revolted and on occasion plundered the city, especially to dictate their demands on the Ottoman administration. And other causes of mortality, I'm sure, can be added to the picture, but I'm just trying to offer you a sense, like a survey of what we can talk about. I mean, perhaps among some minor causes of mortality, we can talk about the more individual cases of death, which we find in Ottoman registers. Perhaps some of them are fatal accidents and drowning in water, falling off horses or rooftops. There are work-related accidents, chronic illnesses, acts of violence, and suicide. However, there's no reason to doubt that plague, again, I would like to emphasize it, plague was the biggest biological killer in early modern Istanbul and in other parts of the Ottoman Empire, and it caused greater number of casualties when you compare it to all other different sources of mortality. Plague killed more people than all other causes combined. Studying mortality reminds us of the inconstancy of the human condition in the pre-modern society, in which human life expectancy was about half of what is accepted in today's developed countries, and even at the best of times. The vagaries of plague served both to make life more tenuous and to significantly increase the level of individual and social anxiety about the apparent ambiguity of life and death. So having surveyed at least briefly the different types of mortality that affected early modern Istanbul, perhaps we can now question the historiography and how historians of the Ottoman Empire and historians in general treated death in the historical scholarship. So despite the ubiquitousness of death in early modern Istanbul, this is not something that can be easily gleaned from historical scholarship. There are several fine studies on various aspects of death in the Ottoman scholarship. For example, there's a growing number of studies on mortality events such as natural disasters. Questions pertaining to death and mortality speak to the fields of urban, social, and cultural history and history of daily life, and have been integrated to such perspectives, especially in the case of Istanbul. But we have mostly works on cemeteries, burials, and tombstones as invaluable subjects to be studied in the history of death and dying in the Ottoman scholarship. There's also some work being done on attitudes toward death, thoughts on the afterlife and the place of the dead in Ottoman cultural imagination, but these are mostly based on literary and narrative historical sources, as well as tombstones. Nevertheless, I believe it remains to be said that death still continues to be one of the most neglected aspects of Istanbul's past, waiting to be fully integrated to other aspects of Ottoman urban history. We might wonder about this, the causes of this neglect and ask why this topic did not become established as part of the mainstream historiography. I mean, I can offer a few reasons of why this may be the case, but I don't think this is peculiar to Ottoman scholarship, and there is, generally speaking, death studies an underdeveloped field. So in general, death studies is an underdeveloped field because for a long time, medicine, psychology, sociology, anthropology, as well as law, education, literature were the areas that explored death more commonly. But the knowledge produced by these fields was mostly for the purpose of serving clinicians, social workers, and health professionals in issues relating to death and dying and problems pertaining to the management of it. And most recently, I think we see the integration of new methods of study in studying death, namely paleogenetics, is becoming part of the picture in the study of past lives and death, but mainly by reconstructing the genome from human remains of the distant past. And in fact, this is a very interesting time to see the progress and development in the study of paleogenetics. And access to aDNA material has been a major competition between different labs. And as we see, most of the individuals that had been studied so far are from Europe. Everything is green here, it comes from Europe. For social and cultural historians, death is still a somewhat underdeveloped area of study. Historians of Europe started paying greater attention to death since the 1970s and 80s, even though earlier historical scholarship on the history of death in Europe tried to construct a narrative of a distinct linear progress from primitive to modern death. More recent scholarship complicated these narratives by emphasizing the intertwined role of breaks and continuities that shaped this process, in particular with respect to the role of religion, magic, and science. Yet it is still telling that we have this field as such an underdeveloped field of study and not really well integrated to the rest of the historical scholarship. First of all, I think it's important to think about the role of modern bias. Modern materialistic approaches to death really don't get us very far. Our modern aversion to death is certainly keeping us from exploring this as a topic of historical inquiry. But how do we overcome this bias? How do we overcome our modern conceptions of death in studying it as a subject, as a historical subject? As historians, perhaps we need to take our sources more seriously. Ottomans, we as Ottoman historians, we need to pay closer attention to how the Ottomans themselves saw death and thought about it and how they conceived it. And perhaps more importantly, the idea of death was part of life. It was imminent and it was everywhere. So perhaps these should be main insights to lead future studies. But how do we situate death and death studies within Ottoman studies? Most of the work done so far gives us information about graveyards, more about typologies of epitaphs and inscriptions and types of tombstones. But we also read about emotions, pain of separation from loved ones or early death that is available in the current scholarship. Of course, one can study the material aspect of death and dying by looking at practices of recording the death, how many died, the more materialistic aspects, how many died, how many were buried, who was buried, where, when, and how, management of dead bodies, how counting, transporting, burying the dead took place, counting practices and management of the dead, as I mentioned earlier, in Ottoman sources, something that can be traceable and a very interesting source of information to study death. Likewise, the economy of death, calculus of death, and experiences of death and dying can be studied to produce a cultural history of death in early modern Ottoman society. In addition, perhaps also sensory histories of death to go along with the more material and cultural aspects of death can be explored. Mortality numbers, as I pointed out earlier, were much greater in Istanbul than elsewhere in Europe. But other than a difference in scale, was there anything unique about death in Istanbul or death in the Ottoman Empire? I should argue that there was something unique to the Ottoman experience. And of course, obviously there's a difference in scale, but other than scale, I think there's also something distinctive about Ottoman conception of death and attitudes toward death. Here, perhaps it will be important to make a distinction between individual death, individual experience of death, and death and dying, and as topics in the study of Ottoman mentalities. But in a nutshell, I would argue that there is something distinctive about Ottoman notions of death and dying, and this has a very important connection to the self and individuality. Attitudes toward death have been an essential component in the identities of societies, and attitudes and conceptions of death and practices. When societies undergo major transformations, it is possible to trace changes in their death rites as one of the most essential core values and practices. So one thing that stands out in the way the Ottomans handled death, which seemed like a bizarre practice to Western observers, was that they made individual graves for every single death, every single person, every single dead body. They accepted the grave as the resting place of the individual and also memorialized the space by erecting tombstones. Graveyards in that respect perhaps can be treated as archives of individuals because name, gender, professional affiliations, social standing can all be gleaned from the tombstones. And so graveyards as archives or gateways to Ottoman lives. But the fact that every individual had their own space dug and used for every deceased body was so striking to early modern European observers that some commented on this bizarre practice as follows: if they continue like this, some European observers say this clearly, the whole city will soon be a mass grave, because of the population of the city, and especially such major mortality events like the plague. But perhaps such comments were not totally surprising.
You're talking about times of mass mortality?
Times of mass mortality in particular. Still individual. I've been working for this, like trying to locate, to see if there were any mass graves, not only in Ottoman Istanbul, but just in major Ottoman cities for the last 10 to 15 years. And there is no evidence of a mass grave. And it is extremely surprising, even at the height of outbreaks. And the height of outbreak for Istanbul, I should underline that we're talking about at least 1,000 to 1,200 deaths per day.
How is this logistically possible?
Exactly. That's the question. I mean, we're talking about something really significant, and it would require a very sophisticated organization, manpower, investment to support and to make this possible. How do you make the city a clean urban space for the health of the living, and how to remove the dead bodies outside of the city walls promptly? And there is clear evidence that even times of mass mortality, they don't do mass graves. So this was surprising to the European observers because the common practice at the time in Europe was that the same burial spot could be used for multiple bodies. This was done by removing the bones of an individual and then burying other individuals on top during standard times and during events of high mass mortality. Of course, there is evidence for plague pits or mass graves. So to finish, I would like to invite us to think about the meaning and significance of this Ottoman practice of doing individual graves for every single body. Was this something that was done out of a respect for the individual of the human body? Yes, certainly. The religious beliefs about preserving the integrity of the body and not harming the body play a role in it. Again, probably did. The belief that the dead body had to be treated and handled respectfully, protected from abuses, was an important principle that governed medical practice and probably extended over death. And I would like to hear your thoughts on this, Miri. So I think the most critical element here is that death and individual burial was a birthright to every Ottoman individual. And historians of the Ottoman Empire, generally try to locate the birth of the self or the rise of the individuality in proxies defined by Europeanist historiography. We often tend to take our cues from the debates and discussions going on in Europeanist historiography and kind of try to locate them in Ottoman history. So hence debates about the rise of individuality often focus on things like first-person narratives. And again, we have evidence of that first-person narratives were produced in Ottoman learned circles. But I believe that studying death could offer us a new context to explore the creation of the self or the rise of individuality in early modern Ottoman contexts. So perhaps this practice of individual graves can be thought as a marker of the rise of individuality in early modern Ottoman society. Ironic it is that we might be searching for the birth of the individual in the death of individuals. But just to finish, I would like to just point out one more continuation or similarity from the European case. Life and death, of course, the twin phenomena continued for many centuries in the European experience, most typically represented depictions of death, most typically represented in scenes of a plague during the Black Death of the mid-14th centuries and the centuries that followed. But we see this most typically in the scenes of danse macabre, dance of death, in which the individuals from all walks of life came together to dance. And I can show just a few examples here. Again, these represent the Gothic epidemiology in Europe, most common starting from the 15th and 16th centuries. And so here in these depictions, we have allegorical references to death and prominence of the disjointed body parts mostly. But again, allegorical the references to death and the closeness of the hour of death, elaborate descriptions of death, can be found equally commonly in Ottoman literary and historical works, in poetry, hagiographies, and in apocalyptic literature, all as reminders that death is imminent and one should be prepared for it. And here I think we can see an image that may be studied in a way similar to the Danse Macabre pictures, reminding the materiality of death. It is also possible to see this renewed emphasis on the visibility of death in Ottoman art in the depictions of the deathbed scenes. And again, here we see a few in Ottoman artwork, including the deathbed scenes of Ottoman sultans, or during their funerals. So arguably, mass mortality was an important factor in shaping attitudes towards death. In the case of Europe, it's been argued that the Black Death and outbreaks of plague that followed it contributed to the making of a death culture, and eventually a Gothic epidemiology, a culture in which death and the body became more visible. Similar allegorical references can be found in Ottoman hagiographical literature to shed light on the imagination of the body when the bodily integrity cannot be maintained, and at a time when this became part of public imagination as a form of suffering of the worst possible kind. Okay, we have one more, and I think this is the end. Thank you very much.
Please. Why don't I start just to
Please.
You raise a number of very interesting questions, but you suggest very few answers.
Good, yes, absolutely. So I'm waiting for you to help me with the answers.
Let me suggest two things that
Okay.
come to my mind. The first is that you seem to connect individual graves with sort of the rise, perhaps, of individuality, but it seems that in most cases, both in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire, the normal practice was individual burial. If it proves anything, it proves that public health or public disposal of the dead in the Ottoman Empire was much better. Because if they could work it out in the West, they would have buried each person individually. They did not. There was no ideology of mass burial. It just so happened because they couldn't work it out. So that's one thing. The other thing you say, you seem to. I can understand. I can understand the you mentioned, and that's very true. That after the Black Death appears in Europe in 1348, but it really goes on for about 200 years. I mean, there's this recurring sort of outburst of the pandemic. So there is you can see changes in everything, in the way they depict Jesus, in the way they depict in ecclesiastical art, in stories. It's everywhere. In new patron saints. I mean, you have special. San Rocco is a special. In the rise of the image of the Virgin as one protecting humanity from her son. Basically, he was the benefit. He was pure good. Now he is seen as partly evil, and partly in this notion of the imminence and the universality of death, which is represented in the Danse Macabre. But the image that you showed us was of a prophet, sort of resurrecting the dead. This is a very traditional image and has nothing to do with this notion of death becoming overwhelming in a sense. Was there anything like this in Ottoman society? Also, the numbers that you mentioned. I mean, you spoke about 5,000. In a city of 500,000. We're talking about Europe. We're talking about 40% of the population. So entire cities were completely wiped out. Was there anything like it in Istanbul? Was there ever an outbreak, I don't know, I know absolutely nothing about it. Was there an outburst that killed, say, 40% of the population, not a few thousand? And if so, in what way did it change, if you want, the culture of death? Because you raise this as something to be studied. Sure, you know something about it that you can share with us.
Okay. You asked me a lot of questions. I'll try to do what I can, but let me start with plague. First of all, the mortality rates, when we compare the differential mortality of how urban centers in the early modern period, starting with the mid-14th century Black Death and the centuries that followed it, both in Europe and the Middle East, we have a very, I think, consistent death ratios across the spectrum. So when I mentioned 1,000 deaths daily, this would amount to, this would continue. Typically in Istanbul, you would have the height of the epidemic in late spring to early summer months. This means that if we, even if in a very conservative calculation, we could arrive to somewhere between 50 to 60,000 deaths in each outbreak. And of course, this is in the major ones. And the minor ones could have resulted in lesser number of mortality. But still, we're talking about a mass mortality. In the European case, yes, it's better recorded, and we know a little more about morbidity and mortality figures. But there is no reason to doubt that there is a major difference between the two, because it is the same biological agent, and it is the same disease that's affecting them. So major mortality. So that, I think we can be sure of that. When we go back to your question of the Black Death affecting Europe, and then, but only for 2 centuries, you said, I think there is now a change in the way the historiography of what we call the second pandemic is reconstructed. The second pandemic being the outbreaks of plague that started with the Black Death in the mid-14th century. And when it ended is actually not, there is no agreement among historians about when it ended. Typically, in the more conventional historiography, you see like the Great Plague of London, 1665, or the Plague of Marseille, 1720, as the end of the second pandemic. It was not. There's evidence that it continued in southern Europe, in some Italian cities until the 18th century. Until late 18th century, it is in Eastern Europe. In the 1770s, it's in Russia. And the Ottoman Empire, it continues until the middle of the 19th century. So we're talking about 500 years of existence of plague recurring in regular intervals. And perhaps mortality declined over time, and even that we don't know for sure, but there is no reason to doubt that it's a major cause of mortality. I believe that, and I'm not the only one to argue this, at least in European historiography, we have clear evidence that plague experience shaped or transformed perceptions of death in the European art, as you suggested, or in rituals and religious practices. You mentioned the rise of new patron saints. I can give examples from the Ottoman case, for example, for the same plague saints, patron saints of Istanbul and other cities, and also in artwork. In reference to the scene of resurrection, I put it in particular because it's a late 16th century example. Yes, it comes from a religious motif, and the depiction there really has clear references to resurrection and prophetic story, the narrative that but there is something that is new in that. Again, I'm not an art historian, but what is new is the depiction of body part disjointed as being more visible in the public eye. And I believe this has something to do with the increased visibility of death and dead bodies in the urban space. And again, I have yet to prove it, and as you suggested, this is kind of still early. I don't have all the answers. But I believe there is a connection. Similarly, when I read hagiographical literature, the biographies of saintly figures in the Sufi tradition, you have specific references to the forms of death of individuals. And they can, regular individuals or pious or impious individuals. So you have specific references to like body parts, just, the descriptions. So what we could perhaps call like morbid or Gothic, representations, both in poetry and literature and also in art. The body, the dead body, becomes more visible. And again, to what extent this is related to plague or to other changes, again, something that needs to be explored. And in the case of the burial practices, of course, I see that it may be a little, stretching it too far to establish that connection just on the basis of individual burial and the rise of individuality. There are other types of proxies that the rise of the self or the creation of individuality in early modern Ottoman context can be explored. Most typically, I think, by literary production, when you look at the ways the authors refer to themselves or the way they produce scholarship, I think there are other indications that, that really mark or represent the transformation to a more conscious form of writing about the self or representing the self as kind of separate. I mean, so I think there is, other types of evidence, but I'm trying to explore if studying death will take us anywhere. And I don't have the answer. I mean, I don't have all the answers, but yeah. I don't know if I answered all your questions, but we can talk more about it, I guess.
Yes, please. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
I was listening to you, I was wondering the whole time, you start bringing out a picture of variety, a city which is visible by many different people, and later you went on in, to my view, kind of homogeneous view of what is a culture and what is this culture of death. And you know that there was this variety of religions, but also within the same community. At the time we are talking, we have all exposed Muslims who come to the empire, and sometimes they have customs and ways of doing that are different than the Ottoman people. So I was wondering whether this otherness is incorporated in your research and how, if it, when you are talking about culture, whether you are talking about purely uses or no.
Thanks for your point, and I think it is important to look at the different components of the overall death practices of a burial and death rites. In the early modern Ottoman case, there are a few that I can identify, and there is some scholarship done on like these different threads. One is the burial customs that the Ottomans seems to have inherited or brought from the earlier Turkic pre-Islamic traditions. But these seem to diminish, especially in the early modern period, and especially in major urban centers like Istanbul. For example, typically in the burial, in funerals, the horse of the deceased individual would follow the funerary procession, and we have one example of that. Maybe we can see the horse here of the distance. And typically, the tail of the horse would be cut in the more, pre-Islamic Turkic tradition. This seems to decline, and we don't see this later on. This one comes from an early 16th century depiction. In other forms, I think there is an overwhelming continuity from the Muslim practices of burial. And again, there's wonderful work done by Leor Halevi on the earlier Muslim practices of burial. So there is a good amount of continuity coming from that line, mostly with respect to how the dead body should be washed, how it should be shrouded, how it should be transported to and burial. So there is you know, something coming from like Muslim tradition, something coming from the Turkic traditions, and of course we also have evidence of different religious communities in Istanbul had their own practices of burial. Let's see. Here we have some of this comes from travel albums. This is from a late 16th century depiction depicting this one as Muslim burial, and I think this was Jewish burial, right? And this one is a Christian burial. And again, I am trying to figure out, for example, if there were specific colors that went hand in hand with, you know, how the coffin was, like what color was the fabric, what colors people wore during funerary processions. Typically, dark colors, as we see in here in the depiction of the Ottoman funerary processions. There's evidence that black, dark navy, purple were the colors, were not necessarily only black, but dark colors. But there's also evidence that, for example, sometimes red cloth was used to cover the coffin. So there's more work to be done. So we know a little bit, but yes, I'm still working on it.
Was the exposure of the body at all?
I have not come across, but it's an interesting question. No, probably not. And there's also some discussion about, for example, how deep the graves should be. And apparently, you know, according to religious practice, it changes from place to place and also from time to time. And because there was, at times of plague, it was required that the graves had to be dug even deeper because they believed that the miasmas coming from the dead bodies could contaminate the air.
Were Christians allowed to bury potent dead in their churches?
That was up to late 15th century, it was common practice. Of course, in the Byzantine times, the Christians were allowed to be buried in the courtyard, churches. Continues for a while, I would say, until the late 15th century because we have evidence. But starting early 16th century, because the city's population is increasing and the dead becomes a major problem, and there seems to be this consciousness that the dead bodies are contaminating the air and causing the disease. So they try to take the dead bodies, especially at times of plague, outside the city walls. In fact, Bayezid II grants this land from his own waqf for the establishment of the first communal cemetery outside of city walls in Istanbul. And then it is divided. I mean, there's the Muslim cemetery, Jewish cemetery, and the Greek Orthodox Christian cemetery, just, you know, in like circling the city walls. And then it expands later on.
And the foreigners?
Foreigners, I think there is one mention of in Pera. I think we can see the, yes, here we have evidence. This is the Galata part. This is the historical peninsula. So we can actually see these graveyards. And then later on, this is from 1530s. Later on, it expands to the hills of Galata. And most typically for like ambassadorial representatives of European states, there is evidence that they were buried around the hill, Taksim Square, and around that area. So I think, as far as I know, that was the location reserved for the European merchants and ambassadors and other elite.
Yes.
Thank you, Nükhet, for a fascinating, very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
In fact. So, continuing on with both your idea of individuality and then the whole notion of the dead as being ever present and death being ever present. So, two things. One, the whole notion of intercession and the fact that, I mean, we talk about people praying for the souls of the dead, but then on the other hand, people expect the dead to intercede on their behalf, so they become a kind of mediating force, which is why, at least according to what I have understood, you have the graveyards associated with mosques behind the mihrab. so that the prayers of the living go through the tombs of the dead, who are then expected, so they're on their behalf, but then they're also expected to intercede on behalf. And I think anybody who's been in Istanbul has certainly seen people stopping by anything that looks like a grave to kind of ask for intercession. So I wonder what you think of this sort of this other direction. And the notion that the dead, although dead in body, are still very much alive and with us in a spiritual sense, but in a very functional spiritual sense. It's not something sort of aesthetic or ethereal. They have a real role to play once they're no longer breathing. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is, I mean, you've talked a lot about all the cemeteries that kind of spring up ringing the city. But at the same time, and then ongoing for several centuries, you have tombs being built in the middle of the city for the sultans.
For the elite, yeah.
But then added to them, there's not just one tomb in those buildings. Those buildings, I mean, I think that the tomb of Turhan Sultan at Yeni Cami has something like 95 bodies supposedly in there with her, all sizes and genders. And actually this is one of my questions, is this practice of multiple graves associated with one tomb, and then also the mosque graveyard, which has many, many tombs in it. I mean, we've all walked around Istanbul where, you know, and you see, you know, each little yard has many, many tombs in it. So is that a much more modern practice? I mean, it's certainly in Edirne, which is the city that I know better. They're very early graves in the mosque graveyards that are contemporary or near contemporary with the constructions of the mosques in the 16th century, late 15th century. So you have these agglomerations of tombs which are allowed to be inside the city in a very particular space, but keeping the dead very present and marking out, you know, certain kinds of spaces in an aesthetic way. So I wonder how those considerations factor into how you then think about both individuality, but then also the meaning of death for the people who continue to breathe and function.
Let me start, again, difficult questions, but I'll try. A great point. So first of all, the cemeteries that continued within the city walls, I mean, of course, we have evidence for those, but I think they are mostly reserved for the elite individuals. And you're right, I mean, it's not only the Sultan or, you know, the Queen Mother, but we have also other elite individuals associated with it. I think it is possible to make a differentiation between how the elite bodies were treated, both when they were alive and when they were dead, from the bodies of non-elite individuals. And here, for non-Ottomanists, I think I would like to make the distinction more clear in the sense that we can talk about two, like a basic main division in Ottoman society as the taxpayer and non-taxpayer population. The taxpayer population, the reaya, and the non-tax-paying elite individuals, generally called askeri, could be administrative, military, or religious elite. Now, the elite, let's call them the elite bodies, even during their lifetime, came under the closer scrutiny of the state in the early modern period. Whenever they had to go through a major health event, whenever they had to go through a major life event, it had to be registered in the Qadi court. For example, when they would undergo surgery, when they received a made treatment for disease, when they had to be relieved from military duty for the timar holders, when they, blanking out. Great question. I mean, I wondered about this for a long time when I was doing research in the Ottoman Mühimme registers, and I think I So almost 100,000 documents from the late 16th century and trying to locate the plague. And one thing that was surprising to me is that there seems to be a systematic record keeping about the bodies of the elite, non-tax-paying population. And I was wondering, I mean, I was trying to question the logic behind the rationale behind it. And it seemed, mostly in the case of the the military elite, it makes sense. Whenever a soldier had to leave their fief to go on a battle, or whenever they were sick, whenever they had to ask for retirement on account of a disability or other cause, you could see this. But there seems to be a generally different status in the way the state handled or managed the health or the bodies of the elite as differently from the bodies of the non-elite, the tax-paying population. So if we take this as a general guide, I think it is not surprising that the bodies of the elite, when they die, is treated differently from the bodies of the non-elite. So, and of course, they had the privileges that the other, non-elite individuals did not have. So in that sense, I think, because of that, they could be buried within the city walls. And when it comes to intercession of the dead, I would definitely agree, because in the hagiographical sources, I think there is evidence of this, but also looking at the tezkire literature, the biographies. I mean, the dead, and again, we're talking about culture, we're talking about cultural imagination, but the dead is never apart from the living. And there seems to be a much closer connection or dialogue, and like even the way the dead is talked about, how they appear in dreams, for example, is as if they're timeless. So that's something that I find, very interesting in reference of how the dead are evoked in stories and storytelling and other cultural references to the dead. But most typically in hagiographies, I think intercession of the dead is, of course, most typically in the case of Prophet Muhammad, but also other religious, major religious figures of Sufi saints, past or current, they're invoked in this imagination. So again, I think hagiographies would be a great source to talk about it. So the powers, the spiritual powers of a Sufi master is not limited to the physical body, and I think there are multiple ways of seeing this. So yes, the dead also could be, in that way, functional and accessible. So all these like tombs and shrines within the city. And still the practice continues of just praying for their souls, but also for individuals, Yes. Yeah.
Is there any project that being made regarding these graveyards at all?
In where?
In these graves.
Yes. Yes. Yes, but this should be off the record. I don't know that I can make this public. Well, I already did it. Yes. We're working on it.
So I asked a different one, maybe you can.
Okay.
In terms of how these graveyards are set, do you have any information that would identify the basis of gender or age?
Yes. Most typically, the tombstones basically tell you, like, there's a very clearly established typology of, like, for males and females, but also, like, professions. You can learn a lot about the lives of the individuals on the basis of tombstones, but also the epithet also, it could tell you a little more about it. So perhaps not always, but age, gender, and profession most typically.
They're mentioned on the tombstone?
Yeah. And also the shape, maybe we can have some examples here let's see, do we have any here? Shape of the tombstone. I don't know that, no, I'm not sure that the shape of the grave, no, probably from the tombstone. I hope we have a few examples here. I thought I did. Okay, I'll try to include this. Yeah. Next time, maybe. Yeah. Huh. Okay, maybe we have a few here. Not very visible, right? For example, the headgear is represented here. You know, this will be a male. For women, there's, you know, mostly kind of like a curve to the tombstone, or like the headgear, yeah, or flowers mostly. And there are other ways of telling, but for example, this would be, you know, typically for a male. So there is, you know, it's possible to tell.
Thank you. On the lecture, a very interesting lecture, it seemed to me that you're talking about two aspects of death which are connected but not correlated.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the danger of death and the presence of death in static meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think they're not correlated. We can see, for example, a very close one in Jerusalem, where death is very present. When we look at people Jews from all around the Mediterranean, even more today, coming to be buried in the Zaytun Valley, and it doesn't mean that Jerusalem is more. The people who live there are more exposed to dangers of death. It seems to me like two different aspects of death that worth discussing as different aspects. And in the case of danger, Istanbul is clearly a marine society. And do you refer in your work to the sea as a source of danger, as a source of trouble, as something that shaped the selfhood?
You talked about the sea as
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to suggest that like danger of death and perhaps pervasiveness or visibility of death might be thought as like separate threads. So I take your point, but I would still say that it is dangerous to think along modern lines to understand early modern notions of death, because today death is less and less visible and less accessible to individuals in modern society. Death is industrialized, and death is outside of our lives. Like the managing of the dead, we don't wash the body of the deceased or shroud. I mean, it's like typically in a modern society, these are functions or tasks that are
strange American custom of embalming the body
or
and exposing it, which is very atypical in some way. And it's something.
Or in like
Yes, but some time ago.
or cremation. But these are like part of an industry, so there is really no access to the body of the deceased. And I think, you know, there's what we are looking in the pre-modern era is like completely different in the sense that the relatives or the close family members, they are a part of that process until the burial takes place. So I think I mean, we just need to.
No, this is just my comment that one of the strange things about American culture is that while it sort of bans dying, and you're not supposed to see dying is now done in hospitals, behind closed doors, in hostels, etc., the body is in fact exposed to the public. I mean, people see, which is for, say, a Jew would be very strange, because when this moment of seeing the cadaver would be very traumatic and be seen only by a small group in the family, whereas in the American culture shows the dead body. I mean, yes, it is made up. Yes, it is.
Christian, okay.
Yes.
I mean,
majority. Yeah, and So in some ways, I was wondering, this is what I asked earlier, are they more aware of the presence of not just of the existence of death, but the body itself? Do they look at the body? Do they depict the body? Is this something that has changed in comparison with, say, past traditions before the Black Death? Right.
Well, in terms of depicting the body or like the accessibility to the physical body, of course, there are like some important gender barriers there. The male body was more visible than the female body to the public eye, even after they were deceased. For example, there are some legal discussions about who is allowed to wash a female body after death. And in fact, as an example to show how long-lasting these traditions are, today anthropologists working or ethnographers working on the funerary customs of transgender individuals, they see that there are still important debates taking place in Turkey about who has access to, seeing the dead body and who doesn't, and which gender. So, I mean, just as an example to show how, those traditions. But to what extent they were visible after death, I mean, especially the female body, would be protected, I would believe. I don't know. I don't think so.
Buried in coffins?
No. Coffin is where the body is carried to the grave, and then the body is taken from outside the coffin and just buried. But coffins are used, but at times of epidemics, of course, in times of high mortality, again, here we have an example that we just see the bier, but not the coffin just, being carried on a plank like this. Would be a, somewhat more kind of, less elaborate form of a small funerary procession from Edirne, 1530s.
Perhaps we can find a comment from some other culture, people in East Asia. What they do in times of pandemic? Does this change things? I mean, they have plagues in China, I guess, in India. Does this change the way they look at death? Is there something like similar to what happened in the West, in the East? Mass mortality, does anything change? Do they bury differently? Do they talk about it differently? Does it depict it differently?
I can only testify for, I'm not sure about burial practices of the common people, but what we do have, and I spoke about very early period, right, say the first, second century CE, what we have are poems and essays or speeches that bemoan the fact that, say, that bodies pile up on the roads, right, because of warfare, because of flags. But that is obviously not, the desired state, and it's always the desirable condition would be to bury them properly. And of course, around the burial and the mourning ceremony and the commemoration, we have a lot of text, a lot of evidence, which makes me think. We have epitaphs, we have dirges, right? We have very clear instructions to the mourners to envision the way individuals used to act and speech in order to really enliven, right, the emotions of the mourners, even in commemoration later. But if you would speak to scholars of early Chinese culture about individualism, you would get slapped on the hand. So the correlation there, or at least this case would provide some contestation, right, for the relation or the correlation between what we perceive as the notion of individualism and mourning and burial practices.
Thank you.
Thank Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck with your research and enjoy
Thank
the rest
you.
of the
I
day.
could not convince you. We have to talk a little more. Thanks.